All right, let's have the roll call for city council, please.
Councilmember Asadrian,
Here.
Brotman,
Here.
Devine,
Here.
Najarian,
Here.
and Mayor Kasakian.
Here. Let us have your report, please.
The agenda for the Tuesday, August 9th, 2022 special public meeting of the City Council was posted on August 2nd, 2022 on the bulletin board outside City Hall.
And can you please read the item before us into the record?
One would be management services regarding final report and recommendations of the Glendale Blue Ribbon Pension Review Committee. A, motion to accept the final report of the Glendale Blue Ribbon Pension Review Committee. B, motion providing further direction to staff.
All right, thank you. Mr. Galanian.
Yes, Mr. Mayor, Mayor Kasakian, members of City Council, as you know, PERS obligation or pension obligation is one of the biggest, if not the biggest, financial challenge that we face. And quite frankly, it's not unique to Glendale. Every city in the state of California is faced with the same challenge. And as such, back in March of 2021, this council directed staff to establish an ad hoc committee to conduct a comprehensive review of our pension plan. We started with 15 committee members. That included members of the community, obviously staff, representative from our association, and we engaged the services of John Holtzman that you see standing in front of you, ready for the presentation. And they held, I believe, 16 meetings over the course of the existence of this committee that included presentations and expert testimony from a number of people. And I just wanted to extend my appreciation to staff members, obviously the members of the community. A couple of them are present here today. Staff that included Mike Garcia, our city attorney, and I'm going around the room, Jason Bradford, and prior to that, it was Michelle Flynn, Amy Martin, and prior to her, it was Matt Doyle and John Taktalian, who spent a large number of hours in the evenings attending these meetings and providing valuable input. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Holtzman for his presentation and open it up questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay? So my name's John Holtzman. I am a partner with Rennie Public Law Group, which is a law firm in Northern California. And I was asked to be the facilitator of this committee that you created, the Blue Ribbon Pension Review Committee. So I'm going to be presenting essentially an overview of the committee's written report. Of necessity, obviously, this is a little abbreviated. There's a lot more detail in the report. I do want to thank, starting out though, our terrific committee members who spent, as you mentioned, a huge number of evenings on this. This was a difficult, often controversial set of topics, but the committee members did a great job. The eventual vote on this, we ended up with 13 committee members because one dropped out, and so the vote was 11-2 on this report. That having been said, and I will note as we go through, there are some areas where there were smaller majorities for certain issues, and I'll do my best to give you a sense of what that is. I also really want to thank City Attorney Mike Garcia and John Taktalian and Jason for a huge amount of work that went into it on their side, and also our senior analyst, Luke Jedson, who did a lot of the writing and work along with Adam Benson, who was a former finance director of the City of Oakland, in putting this together. So with that, let me launch in. We're going to cover the committee itself, the pension problem, how did we get here, what can be done. We are going to talk probably more than you might expect about options that were considered but not recommended, because this is an area where There aren't really any great silver bullets. I know you know that. That's why you commissioned this committee in the first place. So it's important, I think, for the public to understand sometimes why some things that would seem really easy, like let's just change pension plans, are not really that straightforward. And so we do want to go through that. So just to review the tasks, what you tasked the committee with, you tasked the committee with a comprehensive review of Glendale's pension system, structure, and costs, review and critique of Glendale's pension reform efforts to date, recommending options for reducing or eliminating Glendale's unfunded accrued liability, which we're going to be talking a great deal about, or UAL, reviewing alternative financing methods for Glendale's UAL, evaluating the feasibility of alternative retirement solutions, and producing a final report and recommendations to the City Council. And you have that final report before you, and it's in the file as well. As mentioned, there were originally 15 committee members, 10 appointed by the council, 5 by the city manager. 5 of them were to be from labor. In the end, we ended up with 4 from labor and one member who resigned. So in the end, we had 13 members. I do want to emphasize as I present this that, you know, my job as facilitator, we did help put together this report, but this is a report of the committee and not of me, although I'm obviously happy to answer any questions about it. We held 16 meetings, as mentioned. The topics included the pension obligations, vested rights, CalPERS actuarial issues, and actually quite a fair amount of detail on CalPERS generally. We included having the CFO of CalPERS himself come. Well, I say come, it was remote. Pension obligation bonds, Glendale's 115 trust, which we're going to talk about quite a bit. Withdrawal from CalPERS is a possibility, forensic audits of pension funds, and strategies pursued by other public employers. Additional meetings were held to discuss the content of this report. As I mentioned, the report was approved by a vote of 11 out of 13. So I'm going to start at a little bit of a high level, at a level that some folks are going to say, hey, I know all of this, because I want to set the stage well enough for anybody who's listening to understand some of the terms we're talking about. It's always a delicate balance with pension. If I go too deep in the weeds, we lose everybody. If I stay too superficial, everybody goes, I knew that. So I'll do my best to somehow go between the two. But Glendale's pension costs are growing at rates that far outpace the growth of general fund revenues and consumer prices. This puts a significant strain on the city's ability to deliver critical municipal services while also retaining and recruiting a high-quality workforce. This problem isn't unique to Glendale. California's pension problems are many years in the making, and there are no silver bullets or fixes available. I would say, however, that Glendale's problems are slightly on the worse end in terms of the size of the liabilities from other comparable jurisdictions. They're not by any means the worst, but they're also not small. How do we get here? And this is the part that's fairly obvious. Glendale contracts with CalPERS. CalPERS is a state agency that administers about 3,000 pensions for the state, but also about 3,000 public employers in California. It is the largest public pension fund in the United States at $440 billion in assets and over 2 million members. It operates primarily under the state government code, under the laws of the state government code and its own regulations, as well as the state constitution. It's governed by a 13-member board. As a partnering agency, which is what Glendale is, Glendale doesn't directly control, or really control at all, CalPERS's investments, actuarial assumptions, benefit levels, employer contribution rates, or even as to post-2013 at PEPRA, even the amount of the pension plans themselves and what the design of those plans are. So that's a very, very important point. I want to talk a little bit just also about what are we talking about? We talk about pension plans. So we're talking about defined benefit plans. And so these are plans that are created essentially through a formula, such as 2% at 62. And what does that mean? It means that if you retire at age 62, for every year of service, you get 2% of your final average pay, which is usually the last 3 years, we'll say, of pay. So this is a specific commitment that is essentially based on average pay, years of service, and age. Those are the three pillars of it. What is paid out and what is due to retirees is not determined by the employee's contributions to the pension fund, isn't really even determined by our contributions to the pension fund. It is a specific formula. In the event there are poor returns, contracting employers like Glendale are required to make up all of the difference, unless, of course, there's additional contribution made by the employees. So, turning to where the problem began, there was, in essence, a perfect storm that occurred on a rolling basis between 1999 and 2007. Around 1999, in 1999, the legislature passed SB 400. SB 400 provided for enhanced benefit formulas for both safety and non-safety employees. And I'm going to focus on safety because it's just the easier one to talk about. But in safety, it provided for what's called 3% at 50. What does that mean? Again, let's do the translation. At age 50, you get credit for 3%. In this case, it was of your final year or your highest year, 3% of your highest year for each year of service. Or over 30 years, if you retire at 50, you retire at 90% of your salary. So it was a very, very, very generous formula. But that was not the core of the problem. That increased costs. But the core of the problem was that SB 400 allowed, and in the end, CalPERS virtually demanded that public employers implement these changes on a retroactive basis, that they go back to, if a person had been employed for 20 years when this happened, everything, those first 20 years gets repriced at this higher benefit rate. And of course, you weren't contributing at a rate for that whole 20 years that was based on the cost of this program. So you developed significant, and this is true, again, not just of you, but around the state, significant unfunded liability. On top of that, 2001 came along, we had the dot-com bust, which caused the investments in CalPERS to lose value. But then most critically, on top of it, in 2008 and 2009, we had the Great Recession. And with the Great Recession, CalPERS lost in a single year 23%. And because they need to make money at the rate, at the time it was 8% was the discount rate, that translated to a 31% loss in the assets, basically, of CalPERS. So that was just huge and phenomenally hard to come back from, and we are nowhere close to coming back from it currently. And that's true for you, it's true for most other public employers as well. There is, and there was, a great deal of discussion in the committee about fault, I'll call it, in 2001, when this was adopted in Glendale, because it was adopted jurisdiction by jurisdiction. The majority of the committee opted not to go very deeply into that question, simply because it's 20 years ago, we are where we are. There are committee members who, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, I think feel strongly that we need to go further to understand how we could have made such a mistake, as it were. But I would say, importantly, it's a mistake that most other jurisdictions in the state made too. So very importantly, you're in pretty much the same position as everybody else with respect to that issue. Reacting to what happened in 2009, the legislature passed what we call PEPRA, which is the Public Employee Pension Reform Act of 2013. PEPRA did a couple of very important things. It reduced benefit formulas for new hires going forward after 2013. It was passed in 12 and took place in 13. It eliminated various spiking practices that were out there. It prohibited future retroactive pension enhancements, and it required that new employees, who we call PEPRA employees hired after 2013, pay 50% of the normal cost of their benefits. The actual benefit reductions for the new plans were very, very significant. And the new plans are quite a bit cheaper. What's important to understand about PEPRA, however, is it did not do very much of anything with respect to the unfunded liability that already existed. It really dealt with the future. So I want to define my terms a little bit here in terms of the liability, and we'll start with normal cost, which reflects the value of a retirement benefit earned by active employees in any given year and the amount necessary to fully fund those benefits, assuming all of CalPERS's actuarial assumptions are realized. So you can see here that PEPRA substantially lowered the normal cost of pensions. And you can see, if you look on the lines that say PEPRA for miscellaneous, and then there's one for police and one for fire. Let's take miscellaneous first. The PEPRA tier, the normal cost is 13.93%, down from 18.88, which is what the folks at 2.5 at 55, who were in tier 1, what the normal cost was. So that's a substantial reduction in the normal cost. But that savings is completely overshadowed by the problem of the unfunded liability. And what's really important to understand about unfunded liability, and I'm not sure sometimes even that pension experts say this right, is this is the amount of money you owe. I'm going to call it $600 million right now. It's round numbers. It's gone up, it's gone down. Jason and I could have a debate because the numbers keep moving, because the market's been moving a lot. This is an amount of money that the city owes. It is not, and it's expressed by CalPERS, by the way, as a dollar number, not as a percentage of whatever. You can reduce employees or get rid of employees. You could contract out. You could go out of business. None of it matters. That amount of money is simply owed. Now, it goes up and it goes down based on earnings of CalPERS and other things. So it can be moved in various ways, but it is simply an amount of money. So, and PEPRA doesn't help with that, because PEPRA is the new employee. So if it hadn't happened, the number would probably be a lot worse. So it helped a lot in that respect. But it doesn't reduce. There's a myth that people sometimes have that the coming in of the PEPRA employees is going to bring down this number. It does not bring down your unfunded liability number. It does bring down your normal cost. Which lands us where we really want to spend our time today, which is the unfunded liability. And the unfunded liability is the difference between, very simply, the liabilities, present value, current and accrued future benefits, versus the assets. As I say, UAL is an amount owed. It increases when the actual results deviate from the predicted results in terms of investment. And so that could be economic. It could be, and this has happened, longer longevity increases it because we have longevity assumptions. It could be when wages given through bargaining run beyond the 2.75 annual assumption that CalPERS applies when it does its actuarial studies. So there are a lot of different ways in which the number can increase or obviously decrease. This is where there's a little bit of complexity here. This is where you sat when we did the analysis originally, which is that you had about $2.2 billion in accrued liabilities against about $1.5 billion in assets, or $675 million in unfunded liability. Putting it another way, you are about 70% funded. 70% funded is not generally thought in the industry to be disastrous. You want to be 100% funded, of course, and most people think if you get to the 80s, at least you're in shooting distance. And I would say there's a lot of debate about all of those points, but that's sort of just very generally. Now, something that's happened since, I'm going to just try to explain pretty quickly. The June 2020 valuation assumed 7% expected rate of return. The actual rate of return for 2021 was 21.3%. Really good year. Tripled what the expected return was. That would have brought your funded ratio up to about 77% if it hadn't been for this year. The numbers are now in for 21-22, and in 21-22, CalPERS lost roughly, I'm just going to give you a general number, about 6%. And of course, it was expected to make, I'll call it 7, it was actually 6.8%. So you had those two numbers together, and it lost about 14 or so percent, I guess, is that about right? This is it goes to 77%. The other factor, though, that causes us, we're actually, according to Bartell Associates, almost exactly where we were when I showed you that 70% slide. We're basically right back where we were. And that's because the discount rate that CalPERS uses was dropped. The expected amount that it would make was dropped from 7% to 6.8% under a mitigation plan that CalPERS has adopted. And the mitigation plan basically works like this. The better we do, the more they drop the discount rate. Now, you do want that because you don't want CalPERS to assume a level of what it's going to make that's more than it makes, because all that happens is it adds to unfunded liability. But when you lower the discount rate, you increase the unfunded liability because you're not going to be making as much money to pay the system. So the combination of going down from 7% to 6.8%, along with the losses, the 6.1% losses, has landed us in a position where very roughly, and this is all happening in real time, but very roughly we're told we're almost exactly back where we were 2 years ago. Everything okay? So where are we in terms of how bad is this problem? And again, some of you have seen a number of these charts. I mean, in very simple terms, between 17-18 and 22-23, the amount that the city must pay annually for the amortized cost of its unfunded liability, its mortgage payment for the year, so to speak, just on the unfunded liability, has risen from 30 million to just under 60 million. So that's in 6 years. So tremendous increase, obviously, in the cost of funding the unfunded liability. Really alarming. And I think this slide really shows it best. This slide shows the rate of increase of unfunded liability, which is the top line, versus general fund revenues, or general fund revenues with Measure S mixed in. And I mean, you can see we're not even in the same ballpark here. So what can be done, which is obviously why you asked for this in the first place. Before I get to what can be done, let me talk about two things that impair your ability to get something done. The first is the vested rights doctrine, and this is extremely important. In California law, we have something called the California Rule. or sometimes referred to as the so-called California rule. And the California rule says basically the following. Pension benefits become vested when an employee starts work with the employer. To change these rights, the change has to be reasonable, which sounds fine, relate to the theory of a pension system and its successful operation. I'll explain in a minute, maybe not so fine. And then used to say that it had to be accompanied by comparable new advantages, which makes no sense at all, because if you were trying to save money, the comparable new advantages would cause you not to do that. Our firm litigated a number of cases in the California Supreme Court. The good news is that the comparable new advantage requirement in the context of changes that relate to the theory of a pension or its successful operation has essentially gone away. But the court was pretty clear, at least in terms of guideposts, that it was not comfortable with the idea that you could necessarily change a vested benefit for an active employee, because that's what we're talking about here, is just active employees. You can do it for new employees. Just essentially to save money, even if the amount of money that you're spending on it is much greater. Now, I have to emphasize that particular issue hasn't been decided squarely by the California Supreme Court. I'm engaged in all kinds of cases that may test that at some point. We know, for example, that in bankruptcy, you can change pension obligations. But the court was in reading the tea leaves, the court certainly was not positive on the idea that you could just reduce pension liabilities. So this is a really critical issue. Secondarily, though, even if you didn't have the vesting problem, because CalPERS is a unitary system and the law is created by the state legislature and the legislature creates the plans, you would also, let's say you wanted to do a better plan, even for new employees, if you wanted to do a better plan, you would have to have a state law change. And, to state the obvious, that could be difficult in current circumstances. Second point, very important, I think, is you also have to be mindful whenever you're dealing with pension issues and anything you can do in this area of competitiveness. Because you compete for workers. It's no longer as easy to hire workers as it used to be. It's certainly a lot harder to hire safety workers than it used to be. So competitiveness is an important consideration. And I just throw that out because you don't want, by way of trying to fix a problem, to create essentially a different problem. It's also true, by the way, that when people leave, and they leave you with your unfunded liability, that's not even good for pension. So, okay, so options considered but not recommended, which this sort of follows on, but I felt like better to do this first. There was a tremendous amount of discussion, and it's also in your charge to the committee, about the question of could we withdraw from CalPERS. And this is important in part because you're stuck in a system where even for new employees, you don't have the ability to create a new system. If you were to do so, if you were to say our new employees will go into a defined contribution plan, CalPERS would deem that a withdrawal. CalPERS does not allow you to do that. So that's why this is so relevant, even if you were to leave active employees alone. So that's problem one. Problem two is this. If you withdraw from CalPERS, CalPERS revalues your unfunded liability, assuming a much lower risk profile for its investments. And it does so, currently at least, by using an average of 10 and 30-year, weighted average of 10 and 30-year T-bills. The result is that, at least until recently, you were looking at a discount assumption, an earnings assumption of 1 or 2% versus 6.8. So again, every time you lower your discount rate, you increase your unfunded liability because there's less money, there's less economic engine. So CalPERS would want, and this is according to their own valuation, somewhere between $2.8 billion and $3.6 billion for us to withdraw. Now, in fairness, these numbers will have changed a little bit over time for a variety of reasons. T-bills are up, for example. So don't hold me to the specific numbers, but the problem, the fundamental problem will remain the same, which is that, I mean, to put this number in context, it's 12 to 15 times greater than your general fund revenue in a year. So it's a stunning number. To put it in another context, and we'll talk about this in a minute, it's roughly 4 times what your total unfunded liability is at the 6.8% rate that you're currently, discount rate that you're currently working under. So it's a tremendous, tremendous increase in unfunded liability. So the committee looked at this and thought, I think, I mean, and I can't necessarily, different committee members, you know, have possibly different views, but I think one big piece of the thinking is, right now, today, through a POB or whatever, you could pay down the $600-ish million that you owe to CalPERS and have zero unfunded liability. Now, CalPERS might create new unfunded liability over time by losing money, but it's $600 million to get to zero unfunded liability. The only difference between that and withdrawing is if you withdraw, CalPERS has no recourse against you at all if they continue to lose money. But that's about a $2 billion insurance policy. So that is an extraordinary, extraordinary number. And we did not look, I will say, and maybe we were remiss in doing this, we began to talk to some folks about, could you even raise that kind of money in a POB, you know? And we did not really get to the bottom of that, I don't think, Jason, did we? I mean,
Mayor Kasaki, members of the councils, we did look at a hypothetical bond issuance for exit out of PERS. As Mr. Holtzman pointed out, it was extremely cost prohibitive. We just could not make the debt service payments to issue bonds at $3 billion, as was at the analysis used that was presented to the committee, not to mention all the other ancillary impacts, bond ratings, debt coverage, et cetera, et cetera. It's just frankly not feasible to issue that kind of debt service to terminate and exit out of PERS.
thank you, Pat. Next slide. Here's the worst part. Remember vested rights? So the active employees have vested rights. So let's just say we do exit CalPERS. They still have a vested right to the same set of benefits that they had. You wouldn't have to provide them through CalPERS, but you'd still have to provide them. So you could pay $2.8 billion, and you would not be free for your active employees or your retirees to do something different. You would be free to do something new for your new employees. Do you get that point? Which is just basically you would essentially have to recreate the system. So it really doesn't, and to me that's sort of the killer of the thing, is even if you could come up with that kind of money, it wouldn't get you out of the vested rights problem. So the majority of the committee was unconvinced by the idea of withdrawing from CalPERS. I think everybody in the committee, although I'm not 100% positive. Another thing that we, I wouldn't say we rejected, but we put aside, we set aside, we considered, and when I say we, it wasn't really me, it's the committee, but making proposals that have more to do with reforming CalPERS and state system, et cetera. And we did not put a lot of weight on that because we didn't perceive, frankly, that the council was really looking for sort of political advice on what to lobby on, that we were really looking at solutions that were local. But we did put in some of the things that we thought would be good if we were in a coalition and if there became a movement to do something in this area. And there are 4 that are listed here. One, you could guess from what I've been saying so far, is allow current people to stay in CalPERS while creating different plans for new employees. I mean, that would be the absolute number one thing to do. Number two, mirroring ERISA, which governs private sector pension plans, by having provisions for freezing benefits and other things when plans are severely underfunded. Number three, under Proposition 162, the only fiduciary duty that CalPERS has is to the employees and the retirees. It has no fiduciary duty at all, or no real duty even, to these agencies, the 3,000 agencies we were talking about. And, this is a bit of a complicated issue because you do have this fiduciary duty to the employees, but one of the real difficulties that agencies have is getting traction with CalPERS, frankly, because we don't really have any rights. There is one member of the board who comes from contract agencies, so that's as good as it gets. And then finally, demanding greater transparency from CalPERS. We had a speaker on this. I don't want to go into a lot of detail about it, but when you go to the CalPERS website and you try to find out what's going on, CalPERS will tell you it's all public, and it is. I mean, most of it is public. But you would have to know what board meeting to go to see when they approved which contract, for example, which is not really a very transparent way to do things in a complicated system. So greater transparency at CalPERS would be valuable and would allow the constituent agencies to look at how CalPERS money itself is getting spent and the investment costs, et cetera. And then finally, this is the last of the rejected solutions. There were some members of the committee who felt strongly that the city should litigate, or at least should talk to the city attorney about litigating against CalPERS around the benefit enhancements that were in 2001. I can tell you, because I was not here in 2001, but I was in other jurisdictions in 2001. It is affirmatively true that CalPERS misstated what it would cost, and in a way that I have to say, I think was irresponsible. I don't think anybody in the committee had any doubt about any of that. But number one, we didn't really feel like it was our ken to make this decision. And number two, we were not really persuaded to be successful. But again, in fairness, we did not dig deep, and I'm sure Mr. Milano will remind you of that. So, yeah, I give you that one. Okay, so now to what we are recommending. So the biggest thing is accelerating the pay down of the UAL. And this funding the UAL more quickly would reduce, it's essentially the same as when you pay an extra $1,000 on your mortgage, or $500 on your mortgage every month, right? That it reduces the cumulative interest payments. It means you have more money in the market, which then hopefully if the market goes up, it goes up. It gives you much more resiliency if the market turns down. And it helps ensure what we sometimes refer to as sort of generational equity, which is to say what's happening right now, this unfunded liability is being transferred on to a new generation of workers and taxpayers. And so there's something of a moral aspect of this as well. The committee spent a great deal of time talking about kind of how you would do this. And I think our primary recommendation in this respect is to use your Section 115 trust. So 115 trusts are irrevocable trusts that can be used for pensions. As I mentioned, you have one, we're going to talk about it in a minute, but you have, I think, something like about $40 million, give or take, in that trust. I'll get to it. There's a slide on it. These trusts, there are essentially two ways you could put more money in CalPERS, basically. One is just give CalPERS more money. You could just pay more than you owe them in any given year. The other is to put it in 115 trust. I think the preference in the committee was to put it in 115 trust, and here's essentially why. First of all, it is a trust that you control. You can invest it a little bit more conservatively than CalPERS. So it gives you sort of a little bit of an anchor in that respect. It allows you to invest excess funds, however, at a much higher rate than in the general fund, because essentially, like, you can invest in anything in the 115 trust that you could invest in, that CalPERS could invest in, or anybody else. You can invest in equities, et cetera. So you can still have reasonable recovery. And most importantly, maybe, even though everything that goes into the trust can only be used for pension purposes, it can be used, as a last resort, to actually pay your annual CalPERS bill. So if you were to get in terrible trouble and needed that money back, in a sense, you can reuse it for just paying your CalPERS bill. So there's a protection here in that respect. But the other thing here is, this seemed like the right way to at least initially gather up money and not just give it to CalPERS. Because once you give it to CalPERS, it doesn't come out, is the problem. And it doesn't even necessarily lower what you're paying in, it just lowers how long you're going to pay it. It's sort of just like a mortgage in that respect. So, so one of the key things that the committee identified with respect to an issue here is the city does not have a policy regarding its 115 trust as to how much should be in it, regular contributions to it, target balance, how it should be used. And the committee felt very strongly that you should have such a policy. I would note that Santa Monica's study, which is similar to this in certain respects, had a very similar conclusion, although with some detail that we're not following. But having a regimented way that you're putting aside money in this trust would be immensely helpful, and treating it as though it's a real obligation. So right now, as of June 30, 2022, you had $34 million in your 115 trust. That was primarily, you put a very large amount of money, you can see this, in 17, 18, and then relatively small amounts of money, except at 2021, about $5 million went into that trust. So the trust has, it's gone up quite a bit just in the last, I guess, month because stock market's up. The proposal that we're making is that there be a target balance in the trust of $65 million, which is equal to 1 year's worth of the city's current required contributions to CalPERS. And that you annually contribute at least $5 million in general fund money to the 115 trust until that balance is achieved. Once that balance is achieved, the interest that would be generated would be given straight over to CalPERS at that point. That the city should prioritize one-time resources during budget deliberations to expedite the paydown of the UAL, annually review its asset allocation investment strategy in the 115 trust, and continue to target a return rate that prioritizes safety and liquidity and maintain a more risk-averse portfolio relative to CalPERS. So we propose a specific policy, but we also, in the report, and it's not reflected in this because we didn't have time, there are alternative ways of coming up with what's the right number. I'm acutely aware of the fact that the city has had difficulties in its general fund as it is, and so you're looking at me thinking, well, how are we going to get this money? My point, and I can't answer that, you're the council, and we're here for a particular purpose, but my point is that this is, a very real debt. It doesn't make sense to say, hey, we had a good year, when you owe $650 million. There is no such thing as a good year when you owe $650 million, and that's a real amount of money, and it does take discipline to get to the point where it's just every year, this is what we're going to do. I don't think the committee was especially hung up on any, I gave you some numbers, but I don't think the committee was especially hung up on any particular numbers. I'll tell you that in one other jurisdiction I work in, we figure out the difference between, because we think CalPERS is going to go to a 6.2 discount rate at some point, we figure out the difference between the cost, what it would cost us, what we'd be paying in at a 6.2 rate versus what we are paying in at a 6.8 rate, and we put that amount in the trust. We're sensitive to the fact that the council's the one that has to balance these priorities, and we understand that. And so there is a tension very clearly between an ironclad commitment to do X on the one part and the need for flexibility in difficult circumstances in another. And I think everybody on the committee concedes that, but you get the point. Second, pension obligation bonds. So the ball has moved on pension obligation bonds. It used to be that almost everybody recommended against them. Then, as you're probably aware, quite a number of jurisdictions have adopted pension obligation bonds to pay off their unfunded or some significant part of their unfunded liability, pay it down. Some that have timed them well have done very, very well as a result of that. Our witnesses on this pointed out that the timing is dictated by a few different things. One, though, is essentially what's often referred to as the interest rate arbitrage, which is what can you borrow at? What do you have to pay CalPERS? So CalPERS has gone down from 7 to 6.8. Interest rates have gone up. That arbitrage is getting smaller, and you can see it here. And this is old now. Obviously, this is from February. So that makes the timing currently. We felt the window was closing in February. I can't speak to whether it has closed or not, but we felt the window was closing. It's also really important to recognize, just going back to this, that POBs are risky because it's all about market timing. And there are many jurisdictions that borrowed all this money effectively, put it in CalPERS, and then CalPERS had a terrible year and lost a huge amount of money, and then you're paying CalPERS and you're paying for the POB. So they're not a panacea, but many jurisdictions have been using them. I would say that we heard generally much more positive reviews on them than I think we would have heard a few years ago, with the caveat that the window may be closing or may have closed. And so that's what we are suggesting on that, though, is that the city go ahead and file a validation action. You have to file a validation action in order to do a POB. They cost, we are told, roughly $25,000 to do. You can do a validation action and you don't ever have to issue the POB. But because it's so timing sensitive, it's prudent to do a validation action so that if the timing lines up, you can move. So we do recommend going ahead with the validation action, even though you'd have to look, on a moment-by-moment basis, I think, and look to administration as to recommendations of when or whether there's a window. Third issue, there are essentially two issues in transparency in bargaining that the committee focused on. One directly relates to pension, which is being very, very clear. And I think the city is clear. I've looked at how the city costs its labor contracts. The city is clear about how much X wage increase will increase your pension that you're paying into CalPERS, the amount you're actually paying into CalPERS. The two things where we felt the process could be improved was a recognition that if you go beyond 2.75%, that you're also incurring an additional unfunded liability and of a cost. You're not going to be able to identify that cost very easily, and you're not going to want to hire an actuary every time you do negotiations, but that you're identifying that and calling it out. And then second, maybe most importantly, that when you're costing labor contracts, that you're actually showing the additional amounts that we are paying to CalPERS due to the increased cost of the UAL in any given year, which is typically going to be, or has been, and of late, about 2% of wage. So why is this important? And I'm a labor negotiator, so I can tell you why it's important. It's very important that people understand that when you give a 3% wage increase, that actually you've given a 5% wage increase. And that doesn't necessarily mean you don't do it. But we believe that the transparency around those additional costs, are very important because those are employee-related costs. The second piece, probably more controversially, and this was, I would say, uniformly opposed by all four of the labor members on the committee, was greater transparency in the bargaining process generally. Why? Because everything you bargain obviously affects pension. There was discussion of COIN, which I know you're all familiar with, civic openness and negotiation. I don't think that folks were super impressed with parts of COIN, such as having outside finance people or outside negotiators, and frankly, even Costa Mesa, which coined COIN, doesn't use them anymore. But there are aspects of COIN that are worth exploring, and one of them is making sure that you have labor negotiations wrapped up with enough time for people to really review the contracts. Say 30 days. I mean, a serious amount of time for people to review the contracts before ratification. Some talked about what we call transparent bargaining, where bargaining is more open, or at least where proposals are disclosed, those kinds of things. So those issues were raised by the committee in a positive sense. So that's the public bargaining. I'll have to say, as a labor negotiator, I'm coming around to the idea that bargaining is becoming more public, because I think that the notion that we can just make deals in closed rooms is increasingly unpopular. But as a labor negotiator, I'd have to say, and of course I'm old, that I'm a little skeptical in the sense that I think it can be a drag on labor negotiating, and the freedom labor negotiating, et cetera. That's my personal view. That was not the committee's view, but just something to think about. And then finally, pursuing increases in employee cost sharing. The meta point here is this. First of all, what employees would pay normally is safety would pay 9, miscellaneous would pay 8, or in some cases 7 CalPERS. You have an employee cost share. You've had it for many years. It's one of the really positive things that the city has done. Currently, miscellaneous contribute 3% to the employer share, so they go from 8 to 11. Police contribute 3.5. They go from 9 to 12.5. Fire contributes 4.5. They go from 9 to 13.5. What we're suggesting is, if you look at miscellaneous first tier, you can see that they're paying at 11% roughly almost 60% of the normal cost. And by the way, that's fine, because remember, there's still the unfunded liability, which we're paying 100% of. But police and fire are paying between 38 and 44% of the normal cost, not even 50% of the normal cost. So what I've done in many jurisdictions is said, look, at least 50% of the normal cost. Because again, that's the standard that Pepper itself set. It said it shall be the standard. It's not required, except for Pepper employees, but it is the standard. And frankly, you could go higher. The caveat I would give you with that is, obviously, This is all subject to how much resource you have. I realize you've actually lowered the requirement for the cost share in I think, one case that I'm aware of. I understand there are all kinds of different circumstances. You have to be competitive, so we understand that. And so I don't think we're saying you have to do it at any one time, et cetera, but that should be a goal that the city has. So that concludes my presentation.
Thank you, Mr. Holtzman. And I apologize. I know that this is a lot to absorb and take in by my colleagues. I think that we should have some period for questions and answers from the council, but I want to check and see if we have any callers on the line.
Mayor, we do not have any callers.
I know that we have 2 cards submitted. Does council want to ask questions, or should we hear? Let's hear from, sure, at the suggestion of my colleague here, let's hear from our residents who have come to speak to us. Herbert Milano will be the first speaker. Mr. Milano, I'll give you 5 minutes. I hope that'll be enough.
Thank you very much. Members of the City Council, I want to address to you as a member of the committee and as one of the individuals who gave a dissenting voice with regard to this particular report, a report that I do not agree with and that I do not find firmly represents all of the study that is done with regard to this, to the activity of the committee. First, I'd like to ask you, after this presentation, what is your level of confidence that you have on the knowledge with regard to the pension? I mean, it's not a question that you can need to answer to me. It's a rhetorical question because I want to give you a different way of looking at the very same data. About 20 years ago, on April the 24th, 2001, while the City Council was very busy with the Armenian genocide issue, in a matter of 60 seconds, they passed a resolution unanimously, right, on the pension change to police and fire. That change entitled police and fire to receive a pension increase of 50%. It entitled everyone to receive 90% of their pay, of their highest pay ever, on any 1 year, to receive it as early as age 50 for the rest of their life. In other words, they will work for the city for 30 years, maybe they'll retire for 30 years, and that's what basically they were approving. But there's something worse about that. There was no money contributed by any of those employees towards that pension. And there was no money contributed by the city towards that pension enhancement. The overall impact of that decision on April 24th, 2001, has basically cost the city about $1 billion. And on the instant that the City Council made that decision, on that instant that they approved it, about 400 employees earn an extra, on average, $1 million in extra pension. On that particular day, there was no discussion, there were no presentations, there were no rebuttals, nothing. And when I talked to the council members, some of them who were present, they said they did not know. They did not understand the magnitude of the problem. And 2 of them were just fresh off the election. They had been in office just 2 weeks. Without knowing what they were doing, they approved this $1 billion cost. A cost that we have contributed probably an additional $300 million in the last 20 years, and a cost which now is about $640 million or more, given the losses of CalPERS. That's what we're facing, but that's not all. In 2005, December of 2005, the City Council approved unanimously again a 25% increase to all the other employees, maybe another 1,200. So even though it's 25%, it's a larger number of employees. You now hooked us in for another $500 million. The overall impact of this situation is that we have been unable to meet that obligation. And so we have an unfunded liability. In 2001, we were paying $8 million per year to CalPERS, total, which was the employee's contribution. Today, it's approaching $100 million, and it's expected to be $100 million going forward. In other words, we're going to be paying an extra $1 billion in the next 10 years in order to fix this error of 2001 and 2005 combined. The impact on city finances, you'll see it on the general fund. where you see a small portion that used to be for pensions, now it's practically taking up a third or more of the city's general fund. And it's going to be even worse because we guarantee CalPERS losses. Did you know that? Every time CalPERS loses money, we wind up paying for it as taxpayers. In other words, it comes out of our general fund. That's the problem. So CalPERS just finished losing $60 billion, 6%. How are we going to be on the hook even more? So any programs that you have right now pending, either for the environment, for housing, for parkland, for road maintenance, infrastructure, anything, first is that obligation. Ours is second. Our quality of life is being impacted significantly by that particular ordinance that was passed. There's more that I can tell you, but I'm running out of time. I just want to tell you that out of the 15 members, there were actually 5 city staffers. Out of that group of 20, only 4 were not vested on CalPERS. So when they decided that provide and approve this 12-1, or whatever the number was, or 12-2, those of us who are not vested in CalPERS were not necessarily in agreement with this particular report. I have more to tell you if you guys care to ask me questions.
Thank you, Mr. Milano. Mr. Mohill. Next speaker is Mike Mohill. You will have 5 minutes as well.
Thank you, council members. I want to first thank Herbert Milano for that very great in-depth report of what's been going on here. I've known Herbert since years now, and that's his baby. If you want anybody to know what's going on with CalPERS, ask Mr. Herbert Milano. Let me start with my speech. Thank you. Mayor Artie Kasakian, we are very disappointed that you and our city manager, Ruben Galonian, chose on purpose this afternoon 2 p.m. meeting when most Glendale residents are either at work, school, or on vacation to attend this very important discussion on pension reform. Shame on you both. Months ago, when council allowed city unions to be part of the committee, we knew the results would be nothing less than another dog and pony show. Rather than have a volunteer head the pension reform committee, you paid an individual $25,000 to give you the results you wanted. This afternoon, staff has presented to you 5 options towards pension reform, and none of them will have the city leave the corrupt and irresponsible CalPERS pension system. Mayor Kasakian, I guarantee you and your colleagues will choose option 2. Consider the issuance of a pension obligation bond. Will be another Band-Aid fix that our children and grandchildren will be burdened with for life. In 2000, the city of Glendale had over $660 million in unrestricted liquid cash. We were number 2 after the city of Cerritos when it came to reserves. Not today. That reserve would be worth today over $2 billion. Excuse me. Now we practically have 0 in the reserve account. This council and previous council have cannibalized our reserves. None of you have said no to any government union employee salary increase for our overpaid city employees, except for city clerk Arm Ajanian. In the last 5 years, city employees have retired after 30 years of service are making, remember this number, over $150,000 a year for life. Let me say that word, Paula Devine, for life. After all, you are a government employee yourself.
Mr. Mohill, please refer to.
Since being elected, all you have done is increase government union salaries and increase low-income housing. Previous councils have issued GWP bonds for millions of dollars for our children and grandchildren to pay. This afternoon will be another debt for them to inherit from the so-called adults in this room. In the future, there will be more bonds for our children to pay. They will just be calling them different names. This council will blame the previous council for our present situation. Councilman Brotman, we do not want to hear from you. For your reason will be Proposition 13. This is a typical liberal woke excuse, as property taxes have been going up every year. So that boogeyman is dead. Why didn't staff present a sixth option, a $3 billion obligation bond to leave CalPERS? Yes, to rid CalPERS. Council will want to have a pension bond to pay government union employees outrageous salaries and retirement pension benefits for life, but not to get rid of CalPERS. Not to get rid of CalPERS. That should be our end game, end goal, not to stay with this corrupt organization. Many of you have received campaign contributions from the government employees, unions. We'll be watching you again. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Mohill. I will just briefly ask you, you certainly, and anyone who comes up to the dais is speaking to us under the rights of the First Amendment, but I would ask that if you are speaking at that podium, and for anyone speaking at that podium, to maintain the decorum and respect of the officers who sit up here and refer to them by their council member title versus first and last name, as you did to my colleague here. Respect the office and the title that they hold. You may disagree, but you may do it civilly. Outside of here, you can call me whatever you want. You can call me by my first name, you can call me my last name or my nickname. But up here, we are all mayor and council member and the titles with which we serve. Thank you. As far as the timing of this meeting, I do acknowledge that I'll take it upon myself. It was my request from the city manager to have this in the afternoon. And the reason I did that, Mr. Mohill, is because as we come around towards the end of the year, there's a lot of items for us to discuss. This is, as I see it, a study session. There's no obligation for us to give specific direction to staff at this time. But we want to have fresh, clean, clear minds to be able to absorb all this information. We are only human as the day goes on and wears on, and as we're inundated with a lot of other responsibilities, emails, and questions about a myriad of issues in the city, it becomes at least harder for me to clearly focus on certain items of this magnitude. So I believe that, setting aside at least a couple of hours in this afternoon, and I can assure you, for me, this will not be the last time that we are addressing this issue. I myself don't have a desire to make a decision here today, especially one that you will not hear or see a shotgun decision from me this afternoon. If there is one from my colleagues, I would respectfully abstain from it because I do think that we need to further absorb and observe what is happening in the markets to figure out what direction we want to go in. But I do think it is appropriate for us to have this afternoon meeting. The argument that more people would have been able to attend in the evenings, I can tell you that having been here now for 2 years through COVID and the aftermath of it, I don't see how much that would have increased except for a few more individuals. However, it is being recorded and televised and available for everyone to review and watch, and I think it is probably one of the more important meetings for people to watch as we make our decisions moving forward. With that, I want to turn it over to my colleagues. I'll ask Mr. Najarian if he'd like to say a few words because I know he is on a tight schedule this afternoon. He will not be with us in the evening. So, Mr. Najarian.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I do want to thank the facilitator for his many months of work, members of the commission who put in many hours. I watched many of those meetings, and I know that you were all very serious in your comments and your participation. So that's heartening. 2 years ago, I believe, I was the one who said we need to put a commission together because invariably, during every budget cycle, we get suggestions and complaints and criticisms from the public about the pension system that we're in, about it being too costly, about it draining too many funds from other worthy budget items in our annual budget. The claims that we would be better off to dump CalPERS and to go to some other sort of plan, whether it's a defined contribution plan, et cetera. So it was in that, which is probably at that point, it was probably my 16th year of budget, and probably my 16th year of hearing these criticisms, that I asked that council agreed to put this commission together. So I think it's very good that we did that. From what I've read and what I saw, I don't think that leaving CalPERS is an option. It is, not that it is an impossibility, but I don't think it is a wise move, because the costs of that obligation to be addressed, and it floats at several $billion. And I think it's a huge load to put on the city. And I just don't think it's worth it or a wise move. I don't like CalPERS. I mean, let's be clear. I have no love for CalPERS. I'm very, the calm word would be disappointed in their track record of investments, where in the past, in the 12 years from 2008, 2009 up to present, they provided a measly return on, what was it, $440 billion of investments. Absolutely, unconscionable, inexplainable as to how that could happen. Yeah, last year or the year before, they came in with a 20% increase, but this year they lost 6%. What kind of fool loses 6% in this type of market that we're in? And I use that word in a very derogatory manner, because I have no explanation as to how the experts in the industry who advise and consult the PERS board could make investments that went down. I mean, take a dartboard and put the list of stocks and other investments on a dartboard and throw a few darts if you want to diverse your portfolio, and it would have brought factors of greater return over the last 12 years than what we've seen with CalPERS. I don't know if it's corruption at their level. I don't know if it's good old boy brokerages saying, give me the money and I'll handle it, don't worry. I'm not sure what it is, but their returns have been absolutely abysmal with no explanation. I'm also not very happy. I share some of Mr. Milano's discontent with the decisions that council made back in 2001 to extend a retroactive, the retroactive nature of the pension increase in pension benefits. I have no explanation for that either. Council is very much strongly advised by the city manager. The city manager at that time, I don't want to name names, but was fairly well versed in financial issues. I think he had a finance background, at least a public finance background. I can't imagine how there would be any recommendation to council that they extend these extra benefits. It put us in a hole that we haven't been able to come out of, and whether it's $1 billion, it could very well be true. Mr. Bolano, that is just unbelievable to me how that could happen. The fact that 2 of the council members were newbies, okay, but there were 3 others that had been around for some time. One of them holds a position in the city currently, actually a financial position. And I'm not putting blame, but the influence exerted on council at that time to make such a decision clearly is something else I can't understand how that could happen. That's part of our problem at this point. The fact that other cities made the same mistake is no excuse, is no justification. I would, the litigator in me says I'd love to go back and find out what representations were made, and if there were misrepresentations made, and if there was fraud involved, that something happened. I'm sure there would be a list of 88 cities in the county of Los Angeles alone that would join that lawsuit. But that being said, I am happy about the 115 trust that we entered into 3 years ago, 2 years ago, 4 years ago?
Longer, four.
5 years ago. Time flies. We were a little uncertain about it at that time we adopted it, but I think it has shown to be a wise investment tool for us to only buffer. I mean, look, we're not bringing in the riches, but it provides us a few points buffer with our investments, other than what we would have obtained in the LAIF or the city fund investment portfolio. So that is something that I appreciate the commission getting into. I am generally in favor, without getting into any details now, because I'm not going to make a shotgun decision? But I am in favor of looking into a regular contribution to the 115 Trust. I'm not sure if we should, turn the volume to be more aggressive or more conservative. That's something we can discuss. So I am in favor of that. Cost sharing with our employees, I was under, and I appreciate the numbers there, but I was under the impression that Glendale had some of the more aggressive cost sharing contracts, PLAs. Is the PLA the right acronym? MOUs for the collective, the CBA, the PLA for the CBAs, collective bargaining agreements, than many of the other cities out there. I've spoken to representatives from those cities where they say, well, the city pays all of the employees' contribution. And even though police and fire are on the low side in terms of your recommendation compared to the city employees, it's something, bargaining is a tough thing. There's a lot of factors involved. We've just gone through a round with our police department, and foremost on all of our minds was an 8.5% inflation rate, which really was a difficult thing to start right off the bat. I'm not sure a complete open and transparent bargaining process will help. I can see some of the issues that you raised would be of some benefit towards tempering the positions and the demands off the bat for fear of public outcry, obviously. I mean, that's the ultimate thing. But that's something that I wouldn't be opposed to looking into also in the future, seeing, opening it up just a little bit more without revealing positions or intentions of the bargaining group, which is us on one side and the employee union bargaining teams on the other side. Because if you're playing open hand poker, there's not much involved. You've got to have a little bit of confidentiality. So those are my basic, very high level remarks, Mr. Mayor. I appreciate you giving me priority on this, and it's a problem. We just have to deal with it, and I don't think we have answers today, but we've certainly identified the problems. And I think if we keep our eyes open, whether it's through legislation, through some sort of different investment vehicles. You didn't talk about life expectancies. I don't know. I mean, that's a big factor in this whole thing. I don't know how they're going. I'm not sure we're becoming a more healthy society.
I was concerned what our recommendation would be.
Right, Soylent Green or something like that. But anyway, that's another factor which is a big unknown for all of us, which has a great impact on the unfunded actuarial liability. So,
Sure.
thank you. Mr. Mayor.
I do want to turn to my colleagues for their questions and comments, but I've been informed there's one caller, so let's hear from the caller, so Councilmember Najarian can hear from them as well.
Mayor, I have a caller, but I don't have the person's name.
Okay. Just wait a second.
Caller, you're live. Can you give me your name? Caller? Caller, you're live.
Okay, well, in the interest of time, if we are able to get the person, we'll hear from them, but Councilmember Devine, would you like to
Sure.
make your comments and
Sure.
ask your questions?
Sure. I just going to make some comments. First of all, thank you to Mr. Holtzman and your group for working with this group, and thank you to all of the volunteers that that gave up their time, and staff that worked very hard on this. I know it was I know there were rumbles of discontent and about the number of the committee members and the number of meetings, et cetera, et cetera. But in reviewing what this report, the information that this report is giving us, I think that there are some aspects of the report that are worthy of us trying. We are where we are because of our past, because of decisions that were made in the past, and now we have to deal with them. And I agree with Councilmember Najarian. I think we did a really good thing when we adopted the 115 Trust. I did ask staff, when we started with the 115 Trust, there were not many cities that were doing that, and we were taking a bold step. Do you have, I asked for numbers, like what, how many cities were involved in 115 Trust when we first started, and how many there are today? Has that improved?
Councilmember Devine, Mayor Kasakian, members of the council. I was able to get some information from the agency we have our trust with. Currently, they have 149 cities that have a 115 trust, and that is just with them. So there are other agencies in addition to that that take advantage of this ability to open up a 115
And
trust.
I think I remember when we voted to approve this, there were only like about 40 cities that were trying this or moving into this new type of program. I have gone round and round and round with Mr. Mulhill about getting out of CalPERS. We have been to workshops together where the professor from Caltech has said there is no way, it's too costly, you could never, and this was like 10 years ago when I was first elected to council. And he told me at that very meeting, there is no way, you can't afford it. You can't afford it. And you have just reinforced that. However, you also suggested that if we do take out these the bonds, pay down our unfunded, and we're out of CalPERS, we are still obligated to pay the retirees. So what good are we doing? You know, I have to ask myself that. So anyway, I just wanted to make that, I was just hoping, I thought, I'm hearing this, it's like deja vu. I've heard this so many times, it's like too expensive to do. Now, again, I think that a lot of the ideas that were presented are pretty good, and I really do thank the committee and everyone. The informal fresh start, I think, is a good idea. The expedited payment schedule, I think we should do whatever we can to make that possible, and I think that's something we can go into in the future, additional annual contributions to our I guess our 115 Trust seems to have a lot of good reasons to do. I also agree with the committee that we should look at our policy, our guidance to our policymakers on how the trust assets should be used and under what conditions. I know there was a question about we cannot, when we first adopted this 115 Trust, one of the main objectives or the main reasons that we adopted it was not only because it was going into pay our UAL, but also we could, in cases of emergency, like if there was a catastrophe, a huge earthquake, a flood, or whatever, that we were able to use those funds. And I've just been recently told that we can't. So can someone from staff please clarify that for me?
I can certainly try, Councilmember Devine. That is not true. You can use those funds, and I look to Mr. Holtzman, who can maybe help fill in the blanks a little bit. But essentially, the funds that are in the Pension 115 Trust, those funds are intended for use to pay down your pension expenses. what we would essentially do is deobligate funds in the general fund, utilize the funds out of the 115 trust to backfill the general fund dollars, and then in turn use the general fund dollars to deal with whatever costs you just referred to. It's basically a swap.
Okay.
So in other words, anything in that fund can be paid to CalPERS, including to pay your just normal ARC. So obviously you wouldn't, I mean, ideally you would not like to do that. That's certainly not the concept, but it is there for that. It is available for that. And then you would, as John said, you would simply, you'd have more general fund money as a result. It'd be freed up.
All right, okay, so we can do that, okay. The next item was the validation issue, the validation for the POBs. That is a process, as I understand it, that takes 3 to 6 months and costs $25,000. However, that's the con side. The pro side is that we would be ready to buy, we would be at the ready to purchase bonds if the market was good, et cetera. So that's something I think we can think about. Transparency, always important, always important. I don't mind that 30-day ability to review our negotiations, shed some light, let people know what we're dealing with, because it's not easy. The negotiations are not easy, and we have some difficult decisions that we have to make. I also think that all of us should keep in mind that 2.75% that we should not go over, because as I understand it, we have on a couple of occasions, and we might want to be mindful of that. Increased cost sharing, I just think we have to be careful. I agree with Councilmember Najarian in the elected officials that I've talked to and the conferences that I've gone to. It seems that our cost-sharing percentages are higher than a lot of other cities. So I think we have to tread lightly on that one, but it is, I can see a possibility there of perhaps moving in that direction. I think I've covered everything. Increase the annual contributions. I don't know that would we ever be able to get to 65 million? Is that a loaded question, huh? Would we ever be able to get there? But anyway,
The question.
that is the question, yeah. So those are my my thoughts on this. And again, I thank everybody that had anything to do with this, because we've been asking for this for a while, and to finally have some recommendations. It was worthwhile, so thank you. Done?
Councilmember Asatryan.
First, I'd like to also thank everybody that participated. I do have a question I want to start off with, and then I have some comments. You noted that we're not the worst or in the worst situation as a city, but who's in the best, and what are they doing?
First of all, can you hear me? Does this?
I think you might have to press it again, no? Or speak closer into it.
I'm just going to.
Okay.
So, can we, this one? Okay. So the places that are in the best condition have a couple of features. Thing one, most of them had POBs and they timed them well. I'll give you two. Well, the best example is Fresno. They're not actually in CalPERS, they're in their own system, but they have no unfunded liability because they timed their POB well. San Francisco's also got its own system, also has no unfunded liability, but it required, they're not in CalPERS, and it required voter approval to approve changes in benefits. And so that both slowed and brought down the level of the changes of the benefits. I hate to cite any of my clients, but there are some Northern California jurisdictions that have pension rates in safety that are in the high 80%, high 80s at this point. that are certainly in worse shape. Also, you're talking about CalPERS jurisdictions. So, as you probably know, many counties are in what's called the 37 Act.
What is that?
It's they have essentially their own little mini systems, but they're regulated by the 37 Act, which tells them everything. I mean, they have almost no discretion, but they have their own mini systems. Those systems very regularly are paying, employers or rates in the 80%-ish. Realm. But I think, certainly being, I mean, some of this comes down to actuarial science and what group you have and how old they are, and there are a lot of things that you don't necessarily control about your own workforce that drive some of these numbers as well. But it's really important to recognize that that the ability to pay down aggressively, really, I mean, has a pretty substantial effect.
Yeah, question, can I, do you mind, Councilmember Satrian, if I ask, the ones that you cited for the council member, the cities, were not in CalPERS? Is that what you said?
Well, that could be a pattern, I'm not sure. I will say
so that's
37
apples
Act,
and oranges,
Well, the 37, that's partially right. But even within CalPERS, so look, I mean, CalPERS's investment return is basically the same across the board, right? Because everybody's effectively, even if you're in your own subgroup, basically the investment mix is the same. So the differences that you're going to see have much less to do with, investment mix and more to do with size of unfunded liability.
If I may just add, perhaps, one other thing that also plays a factor is not just the size of the organization and the plan, but the age of the organization as well. Newer cities that don't have old plans with a lot of retirees on them typically tend to have a lower unfunded liability because those are benefits that aren't being drawn down on yet. Also, agencies that are extremely small or used to be larger and are extremely small nowadays have very, very few active members as retirees, also tend to have 80, 90, 95, almost 100% funded status. So it's not a matter of investments for agencies that are in the plan as much as it is all the other factors associated with it.
That's
Okay,
a really good point.
I'd like to rephrase my question
Sure.
so I can get the answers
Sorry.
I'm looking for. For
Sorry.
cities that are in CalPERS,
Yeah.
that are the same size and makeup, and have the same history as Glendale, that are doing a much better job, what are they doing differently?
Well, look, there aren't that many
Is it
levers.
25,000
So, first of all, I would say anecdotally, and we didn't want to get into labor relations too heavily here because we're trying to sort of keep these separately. But obviously, what you do in your labor relations has a big effect on what you pay. What's interesting about Glendale is you've been conservative in your labor relations. Your salary, I mean, not always, but in general, over a 15-year period, your salary increases have been very reasonable. So it isn't that. So I'm sorry, I told you what it's not what it is. But the other things John mentioned are very, very, very important. It's not really something you control. The ratio of retirees to actives is a huge. When you cross the threshold, I haven't checked, it's been a while since I've looked at your numbers. When you cross the threshold of 1-to-1, one active to one retiree, that's when you start getting really expensive. When you start, And so I don't know, John or Jason, where we are, but that's another factor. And then the third factor, is some folks have gotten ahead on funding. I mean, and we've often recommended that people pay more into CalPERS. One of the things that happened was CalPERS used to have this sort of what we used to call super spreading, or super, I forget what super spreading. Oh, that's COVID. The cushion. In any event, where they spread out their losses over a very long period of time, and so the result was it was equivalent to taking a loan
from CalPERS at a very, very, very high rate. And so the Bartell folks, for example, were adamant about people trying to pay, what they should be paying. And I mean, I think, and again, I can't cite to you whether that made a difference for those particular jurisdictions. I just don't know off the top of my head. I'd be happy to look at it. But clearly, the one thing you really can control, other than wages and benefits, is funding, and I think that's the single biggest concern.
Would it be possible for us to get a
Yeah,
comparison report? And again, I'm not looking at getting information like ratio of retired versus active. I'm looking at possible solutions that they've implemented in place.
Sure. So I'd be happy to, this is very easy to do. Bartell and Associates has a very large database. So it's a simple query for them to run, and I can probably get it as well as an explanation of why they think what they're seeing.
The recommendations that were provided in your report, did it include any of these studies comparing to other cities? Or was it just based off of the meetings that you guys had and the conversations you had?
We have certainly compared as to programs like the 115 programs, but no, not in the way that you were saying. Not in terms of rate.
Okay. So I have, I guess, a couple of comments. I am open to establishing a greater transparency when it comes to our bargaining. I would like to see us do a formal policy and have consistent contributions annually. I would like for us to review on how we get our safety up to 50% to match up with the rest of the employees. I think we should have a fair system. And I think that's all I have for now, but that would be it. Thank you.
Councilmember Brotman.
Thank you. Okay. One thing I'll ask kind of in the way of a question. You didn't really talk about the time trajectory of this whole problem. And I remember looking at earlier charts, I think Mr. Milano might have given them to me, which showed kind of towards the end of this decade, we peak and then it starts to taper as we get more of the Pepper employees, that mix becomes more dominant. With the current market losses, has that changed? Where do you see that? What's the time horizon we're really worried about?
So if you look in the report at page 30, and we, by the way, this is a sample of about 50 of these charts that sort of look like this, but what you're really seeing is that you're peaking, that this is, if you hit the 50th percentile, which essentially means you're basically making your numbers, that you're really peaking right around 30-ish to 2030 or so, 2031. But if you look at the chart on page 30, it also shows you what happens if we hit the 75th percentile and what happens if we only hit the 25th percentile in market return. Obviously, if you only hit the 25th percentile market return, it not only elongates the process, but the numbers go from the predicted numbers of about 64% this would be for safety, to about 85%. So they're pretty fluid.
85% of the salary base
that's right.
that we're paying in each year. Yeah.
That's exactly right. Yeah. So there's a lot of risk there. What I would say, I'm very hesitant. I've been around long enough to watch this chart creep into the 30s, but if the Bartell numbers hold true, you're going to peak at about 65% in basically the early 30s, and then come down after that slowly.
Okay. So I just thought it was important to point out that for everybody to understand, public and all of us, it's not an what's the term? Ad infinitum kind of situation. It doesn't keep going on. We've got this decade where it's going to get worse and it's going to reach a peak, I guess you're saying early 2030s, and then it's going to start to taper off. So we do have a finite, in a sense, a finite problem that we have to attack. I like to keep that in the back of my mind. So that was the question. As far as comments go, I'll start off with the thanks, Mr. Holtzman, the staff that worked on this, but especially the 10 appointees on the commission that were not paid and did this, totally for free out of the goodness of their heart and their concern for the community. So I really want to thank those people in particular. I know that there's been a lot of ink spilled, a lot of comments on how we got here. Clearly, some disastrous decisions were made back in 2001, compounded in 2005. Clearly based on misleading or information, or if you want to be more generous, wishful thinking from CalPERS. And clearly, the courts are tying our hands in dealing with this. All that, and Mr. Milano has been very articulate in explaining that. However, that's history, and I really don't think it's fruitful to spend a lot of time going over again and again the history. I think we really have to be thinking about solutions. I don't think getting out of CalPERS is viable or prudent from a financial point of view. The idea of bringing a lawsuit against CalPERS, it's a great idea. I think it's just totally unrealistic. We would have to show fraud, and mistakes are not fraud. I think it would be very hard to show, and we'd probably have to end up going to the Supreme Court, because I don't think California would necessarily be all that supportive. I just don't think it happens. So we're stuck with the commitments we've made, and we have to deal with them. There is one aspect that is still current, though, and that is that we do have kind of a built-in bias, in particularly towards safety employees and the benefits they receive because of the politics of endorsements. And I've talked about this before. I do not think council candidates that get endorsed by police and fire should be making decisions on the pensions or on the salary negotiations of police and fire. Well, I would spread that across all the bargaining groups, not just police and fire, but they tend to be the ones to endorse. I think that's important. I don't think anybody's ever really tackled that here or really discussed it seriously, but I think that's a fundamental problem that underlies all of this is a political problem. And we need to be honest about that. In addition to that, I think transparency is always good. I don't think that means our closed session discussions where we're giving instructions to our negotiators can possibly be open. That makes no sense. That's like playing poker with an open hand. However, when the two sides get into that room and they start negotiating, I think that is fair game for that to be public. And the positions, the starting positions that are put on the table by the two sides, I think that's fair game too. I don't see why that the public should be excluded from understanding where we're starting and where they're starting. So I would say that. I did also, like Councilmember Najarian, listened to a lot of the sessions or watched a lot of the sessions. And I thought one of the most interesting ones was Rick Cole's presentation. And he said something which just summed it up. And I can't agree more. He said, we have three options. I mean, obviously, we can't pay these obligations with our current resources. I mean, we can't just keep kicking the can down the road. We have three things that we need to do, or that we can do, and I think we need to do all three of them. One is we are going to need new sources of revenue. I don't think, nobody likes to talk about it, but we are going to need new sources of revenue in order to meet our obligations and keep our city functioning. We are going to need to renegotiate cost sharing with our bargaining units, no doubt. I support this idea of getting to 50% for police, but I think across the board, we are going to have to do that. The bargaining groups, the employees, are going to have to contribute to solving this problem. It's not fair because a lot of the benefits are going to people that have already retired. I get it, but they're going to have to be part of the solution. We're going to have to cut costs, and that may mean cutting services unless we can find costs to cut that aren't going to impact services. There's always some fat out there. I think we need to look at things that we can outsource. We have to look at things that we can maybe partner with other cities and not have redundant activities or make redundant investments. And I think, as he said, as Rick Cole said, we're going to have to do all of these because it's got to be shared pain, right? It's got to be shared. The community is going to have to step up and help us with additional revenues. Staff is going to have to step up, and there's going to be impact to services. So let's just be honest about that. We also may have to consider selling assets. Something I think we haven't probably really wanted to talk about, but I was just talking to the city manager about. maybe I won't go into it, but we may have some assets that we need to sell in order to raise money. And because this is a finite problem, it's not an ever increasing situation, there may be some logic to doing that and paying down some of those obligations early. Okay, so on specific direction, I'm not interested in the pension obligation bond. I think it's risky. I just the idea that we can outsmart the market, I think, is dangerous. So I would not be interested in going ahead with a validation, even though it's only $25,000. I'm just not interested. I do like the idea of setting aside a fixed amount of money each year to handle this obligation. I would much rather see us pay CalPERS directly and pay down that mortgage than stick it in a 115 trust, which I think it's just too tempting to raid that trust. And also, it's like when you're paying down a mortgage, let's say your mortgage is 5 or 6%, you're going to pay that back unless you think you can earn more than that yourself, right? If I have money and I think I can earn more than the cost of my mortgage, well, by all means, I should keep that money, invest it, earn more, and pay off my mortgage. I don't think that we can reliably earn more than whatever that discount rate is, whether it's 6-7% on a consistent basis with a conservative investment policy. So I don't like the idea of the 115 trust. I think pay down that mortgage as quickly as we can and have it on a regular schedule. We can always have an out if there's a COVID emergency or an earthquake or something. There can be an out. Maybe you need 4 members of council to vote to suspend that payment, whatever it might be. But I think that's what we should do. Let's see. I also think that, just my last comment will be, this is a problem, I think, Mr. Holtzman, you put it well, that we're kind of throwing this problem on future generations. We're doing the same with our deferred maintenance, something that Mr. Milano has been very passionate about, roads, sewers, whatever else it might be. That's what gets cut, right, when we're struggling. We can't keep throwing that onto future generations. I talk a lot about climate and environment. That's another place where we're throwing a lot of costs onto future generations by not addressing things now. I would like us to look at an infrastructure bond, raising money to get ahead of some of the road and sewer work that is going to just become more expensive the longer we wait. If we could do something like that, find a new source of revenues to pay that infrastructure bond, and start improving the basic infrastructure of the city of Glendale now, and lock that in so that we have to do that. I think that would be wise, that would be prudent, that would be honest to the future. And I think I will leave it at that. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Well, one of the reasons why we're here is because pensions in the early 2000s were treated much like the speculative housing market was back then. There was really a euphoria about where people were making money. And unfortunately, city organizations, both the management, the bargaining groups, and the council members who approved these, voted in possibly what can be described and has been described in various ways, say in the worst possible way. And so we find ourselves here at this juncture trying to figure out how to get ourselves out of this mess while we have other demands from the community. And I appreciate Mr. Milano and Mr. Mohill and others who over the years have raised the issue and raised the alarm about this. But, you know, as much as we hear from them, we hear a lot more from everyone else in the community about all the other very specific, very localized demands and needs that our community has. And oftentimes we get caught up in those discussions as well. And the work that we do here on the council sometimes feels like we're picking out the drapes on the Titanic after it's hit an iceberg. So what we have to do from this point out, I'm not ready to necessarily make the decision here today because this issue is far, far greater and has greater ramifications than anything that we're going to be able to throw our best efforts at. I would like us, however, for this to be a continuous discussion. I do have some questions, and I think some of them may be related to what Councilmember Asatryan and others have said. And it would be, for instance, as we talk about unfunded liabilities, I would like to know what the listing of is or ranking of agencies from greatest unfunded liability to best unfunded liability within the CalPERS system. I would assume and hope that that information should be available somewhere in the great state of California. And to know who those individuals are. Now, maybe it could have been a part of the presentations, reports, I may have missed it, but I would like to know that specifically to narrow it down even more for cities of 100,000 and above, or agencies that have a comparable employee count. So we have a couple of metrics by which we can see and compare ourselves. It's pretty awful where we find ourselves headed, where we have obligations that are enough to fund a second government, where we have individuals that retire. We are on the hook to be able to pay them for the services that they provided the city for many years, through not necessarily any fault of any one individual, but for a series of bad decisions. And then that we have to also hire to fill in a position to continue the work that the city and the public expects of us to do. I'm going to read from, there was a comment made by one of the speakers that I want to respond to, who, in a moment of finger wagging at us, said that we were all supported by, or some of us were supported by the bargaining units. And I will say this, and I make no apologies for it. I pushed for the employee unions to have a seat at the table as this discussion was happening. And it's not because I was supported by any of them in my run for council. It's not because I took a single dime from any of those unions when I ran for council. But I will tell you that, well, at least from the public safety ones, I'll have to go back and check. I don't know about IBW, but I don't think I took any of their funds knowingly. I did not receive the endorsement, certainly, of the police. I did not receive the endorsement of the fire union. But I want to read something why I think it's important to have our employees who work very hard, and have continuously worked hard as we've made cutbacks, made cuts into our work, our employee count in the city. This is from the Little Hoover Commission report on the same issue roughly 10 years ago. It says, public employees might appear to have little incentive to push for reforms, which is the narrative that we hear oftentimes. Sure, why would individuals who benefit from this very system that we're trying to reform try to reform it? But the reason why they have to have a seat at the table, and the reason I believe they should always be involved and informed, especially when they come back to the table with certain requests and demands during bargaining, is because, and I quote, "Yet they will pay a price for inaction, salary freezes, layoffs, increased payroll deductions, and the threat of a city or county bankruptcy. Doing nothing to current pension obligations will cost public employees everything. A pension cannot grow without a job attached to it." So if we are going to make hard decisions that impact the very people who we expect to keep our streets paved, our sidewalks repaired, have the city and the city hall functioning, it is imperative that they be at the table understanding that we're in this together. It is not an us versus them. It is all of us together. And unfortunately, because of the fault of previous councils and others, we've gone into this compensation arms race among communities where we get approached. In fact, it's happened numerous times where a bargaining group will come to us or one of our unions will say, well, this city is paying this. And if you don't, then people are going to jump ship and go to this agency or that agency. We're dealing with that, folks. And every time we let someone go, we let someone with decades of experience leave Glendale, our organization is worse off for it, right? We have to start from scratch. We have to hire and retrain, and it's not as easy said as it is done, or it's easier said than done. The cost of living has continued to go up. It is certainly more expensive to live here in Glendale, both for our employees and for everyone else. And this is going to take a long, long time for us to resolve. But every discussion we have about budget and finance and increased expenses needs to start off and be viewed through this lens. One question I had is, do we know when the city joined CalPERS?
I know it's been in a previous report. I hesitate to tell you off the top of my head, but
It's
it was
fine. We're
in
going to
the
come back. We're going to revisit this issue.
30-something.
It's fine. I'd like to have that answer, and I'd like to know, I know how many employees we have. It would be good to know where we were and how we got here, and one of the ways is to know when we joined this mafia that goes by the name CalPERS, and I say mafia because apparently it's easy to get in, but it's impossible to get out. One question I have is whether we can cap salaries. We know that a lot of the obligation that we have is, or some of the unfunded liability, and we had this period of, again, people retiring at their one single highest year of salary, including overtime, and then after the Bell scandal in the city of Bell and everything that came out of it, there was some efforts at reforms. But the greatest burden on the taxpayers is not necessarily your person who's making $30,000, $50,000, $60,000 a year. It's really the top earners, right? And of course, with that comes a lot of the individuals in public safety. Of course, they have a dangerous job. They have to be compensated for it. We understand that. But management as well, some of the top management, and again, I'll bring up the example of the city of Bell, where the city manager, I think, was bilking the residents of that city to the tune of $700,000 a year or more just for their salary. And that would also be PERSable, right? Not any more, but that was the scenario that kicked off some of the reforms. But why can't we, and this is a question for Mr. Holtzman or for anyone else who can answer this, why can't we cap salaries at whatever number we decide, or the IRS or the state tax franchise board decides is the reasonable amount, $170,000, $150,000? And we understand that we're in a competitive market where if we need to pay people more, pay the difference of that salary in another manner, whether it's a bonus or if it's through another structure, and that can be tied to a different type of retirement and investment fund.
John's going to respond, I think, too, but let me give you the actuarial response to that, because I've had a lot of conversations about that issue. So the way the actuaries would look at it is, in the end, you're going to pay market. Because, I mean, sure, you could be a little below market or a little above market, but in reality, you're not going to be able to attract talent Therefore, an actuary won't give you, because I've had this discussion in a different setting, which is give me credit for the fact that I'm capping salaries, right? And the actuary will tell you, well, I no, because I don't really believe remember pension, it's very important to think about pension over long stretches of time. So even with respect to the 2.75 we've talked about, it doesn't matter really if you give people 5% in a given year. What matters is what you've done over a longer period of time. And so I think that's the challenge, is simply market competitiveness. Right now, many of my clients, I actually have a client, if you can believe it, that's arguing with CalPERS. They want a higher tier because their tier 2 is too low and they can't recruit. Talk about swimming against the stream. But the challenge is, even on the PEPRA side, because with PEPRA, as you know, there is the cap now, a salary cap, and a lot of my clients are reporting they're having a lot of trouble recruiting for higher level people. And so that's the challenge. I mean, there's nothing. It would save you money if you could hold it.
What is the PEPRA cap?
I want to say it's a Social Security threshold.
It is. That's right. It's a social 170
something.
Correct? Yeah. Okay.
It's 170 something. Yeah.
So how are agencies hiring, say, a city manager whose salary on average exceeds $200,000 a year? How are they doing that?
I think that, well, I don't know, John, maybe you probably have a better, or Mr. Manager, you may have a...
I could. I would say that agencies that are hiring city managers are generally hiring city managers who are classic members. Yes, they're generally hiring city managers who are classic members. So when we talk about PEPRA, those city managers typically aren't coming from the private sector to the public sector at the tail end of their career to be stymied by some of these caps. I think what we'll see is, over time, that becomes less and less of an issue as you have a PEPRA employee working their way through a career and making it to that level.
And if I may add to that, the experience that I have seen more specifically recently is typically higher level recruitments happen with individuals who retire from a separate pension plan and then join PERS as an additional, commonly known as double dipping.
So it's challenging. I think you just have to look at it as, this balance that you but tying your own hands with respect to how you can recruit can be challenging and can cost you money if it means you don't get top talent. So, I mean, I feel like I'm arguing against myself, but
there's nothing necessarily in the PERS rule book that says we can't do that.
Not at all. Not at all. There is, however, I mean, one issue, you do have to collectively bargain, right? So you can't, this wouldn't be true, it wouldn't be a problem for unrepresented managers, but for anybody who's represented, it would be very difficult on a completely practical matter, labor-wise, to go in and for any length of time hold down. And of course, you'd have compaction too over time if you're choosing a cap. So I'm not. I mean, I understand the point, and I am arguing for keeping wages down. I'm not sure a cap works as well as it might seem.
And if I could just add, Mr. Mayor, and I don't know, I would ask John the same question: is if you had the cap and then you make up the difference via a bonus, if that became a regular occurrence, I'm not sure PERS wouldn't treat that as PERSable salary. So if it was, $170,000 cap and then an annual bonus of $50,000, that just became a regular occurrence based on meeting the performance goals, whether or not PERS would treat that as basically PERSable.
I've heard that before, and I'd like to have some clarification from Mr. Holtzman or from anyone who can come back with more information as to why that would be, if that's not going to necessarily impact the overall repayment or retirement obligation that PERS would pay out to said employee. They only have to pay out to the $170,000 that the city has made the promise to, has made the payments on, and anything else would be returned, is separated from that. So why would that necessarily be an issue? And I've heard that on a number of cases, that PERS comes in and makes these demands on what the city owes, what it can count. Certainly I understand if you have someone who's working regularly and is not being paid, whether they're hourly and you're not paying into other benefits, et cetera, I would understand that. But in
Yeah.
this case, you are clearly stating that we're going to pay up to what the Social Security threshold is.
So, yeah, I mean, I think that's a bit of a research, this one-time issue, because the regulation itself is not very clearly written, and that's part of the problem. But I'd be happy to, work with Mike and get to the bottom of that pretty easily. We've got access with people at CalPERS who tell us how they actually apply it.
Well, the hour's getting late. I do want to give my colleagues the opportunity to take a break before we continue with the evening's meetings. I do not have, I know that there's been some comments made here around the dais about directions that you wish to go into, or some of my colleagues wish to. I would like to see this issue or this report at this moment, note and filed with us in the future, looking at what are some of the more, what would be the financial and fiscal, the fiscal impacts of some of the recommendations that have been made. And also looking at, the one thing I do agree on is that we do have to, I would not say let's go towards a 50% share or not. Certainly that sounds great, without looking at where other agencies are, where we are in comparison to others. So I do believe, and I don't know if my colleagues would agree, we do need to have a follow-up meeting maybe in a few months on this.
Yeah, Mr. Mayor, I completely agree with you. If council could move to accept the final report and the recommendations, and there's been a number of questions, as stated, that require some research and some direction from individual council members, so it'll behoove ourselves to bring back a report with responses to our questions and provide you a menu of options to select from and direct staff to move forward with.
Okay, so the motion would be to note and file, not to accept the recommendations of the report necessarily, because,
Just to accept, well, it's to accept, since they prepared a report, it'd be to accept the report, but you're not necessarily accepting the recommendations or agreeing to implement them.
okay, so I'll make that motion to accept the report to, I don't know if it's to note and file also,
Yeah.
if those are separate.
I'll
Okay.
second.
Okay, so there's been a motion to accept, or rather to note and file this report with an understanding, I believe, or would my colleagues, do you accept to have a
Yes, I do.
revisit to this issue? Okay, to have us revisit this issue for a follow-up study session once we've had a chance to gather some more information. So may we have roll call?
Councilmember Al Sadrian,
Yes?
Brotman,
Yes.
Devine,
Yes.
Najarian, and Mayor Kasakian.
Yes, thank you. All right. Thank you very much. May we have a motion to adjourn this special meeting?
I'll move to adjourn.
Second? From anyone?
A second.
Thank you. All right, with that, let us move on to the city council meeting agenda, so we can call to order for the closed session. Let us not go off the air, please. And with that, we'll wait until, all right, let's have roll call for city council.
Councilmember Al Sadrian,
Here.
Brotman,
Here.
Devine,
Here.
Najarian, and Mayor Kasakian.
Here. Can you please read the closed session items into the record?
Items 1A, conference with legal counsel pending litigation, Dixon versus City of Glendale, LASC case number 21STC V08281. Item 1B, public employee performance evaluation, city manager and city attorney. Item 1C has been moved. 1D, conference with real property negotiators, property location, real property generally located at the terminus of New York Avenue near Park Vista Drive, commonly referred to as Mountain Oaks. Negotiating parties, FENM Incorporated, Employees Defined Contribution Plan, Trust dated July 10th, 1984. Agency negotiators attending the closed session are Rubik Galanian, Michael J. Garcia, Jillian Van Meiden, John Toctalian, Silvio Lanzis, Jason Bradford, Christine Powers, and Onik Bulanikian. Instructions to the negotiators will concern the price and terms for the acquisition of property. E, conference with legal counsel pending litigation, FENM Incorporated, Employees Defined Contribution Plan Trust, dated July 10th, 1984 versus City of Glendale et al., LASC case number BS 16989.
Okay. Do we anticipate reporting out on any of these items?
Yes, Mr. Mayor, item 1A, we anticipate reporting out.
Okay, with that, let us recess to close session to return at 6 PM or as close to it as we can. Thank you.